Hi, this is Nicole Dyer with the Research Like a Pro question and answer series. And today our question is, what research objective should I start with if I am a beginner? And this comes from our Research Like a Pro study group. And we've been talking about the first lesson, which is setting up your research objective for your project that you'll do throughout the study group. So hopefully this helps anyone who's thinking about starting to work on a genealogical research project and setting their first objective. So the question that came up is basically that I'm a beginner and I don't know what research objective to start with because I have a lot of questions about my family history and I'm just not sure which one to start with or which question to choose. If one is better than the other, I just have so many questions and that kind of thing. The foundation of making a research objective is starting with what you know. And this usually looks like beginning with yourself and working backwards. You can gather information from your own knowledge, living family members, any family documents, photos, or heirlooms in your possession, and family stories and oral traditions. So the key principle here is work from what you know to what you don't know, and from recent to distant. You don't want to set a research objective for your great-great-great-grandfather if you haven't figured out anything about your grandfather yet. When formulating research questions, it's good to take your natural curiosity and turn it into specific objectives. So you might have questions about what was my great-grandfather's occupation in 1920? Where did my grandmother's family immigrate from? What happened to my great-aunt who disappeared from family records? And these questions all come up as you're organizing the known information. So as you think of them, write them down. You will want to avoid vague objectives like learn more about the father's side of my family, or learn about my mother's side, or learn what's true and what's false about this whole family history that someone wrote. You want to have something more specific. Another thing to consider is record availability. And if you are choosing a time period that's either too close to the present or too far in the past, you may come up against challenges with record availability. And that could be because of privacy laws, where recent events may be restricted and private only to those individuals named on the record or their immediate family. Also, it could be that some records don't survive due to wars and disasters, poor storage, and then also consider the jurisdictions where records would be available, whether at the federal level, state level, county, or local levels such as counties or townships, and thinking about which of these jurisdictions might hold the record that you want, or that might have the answer to your research question. A lot of these things are done in the Research Like a Pro process during locality research, but you can also do some preliminary locality research to help you choose your research objective because it will help you to know how successful your objective might be. And especially if you're feeling a little newer to genealogy research, you're closer to a beginner, then you will not have as much experience to know if your research objective is attainable or not based on what records are available. So doing just a little research on that can help you. So what are privacy restrictions and access rules? Well, recent records often have privacy protections, and some of the common restrictions you might see that death certificates, for example, might not be available for 50 to 100 years after the death occurred. And similar for that would be birth certificates. Sometimes it takes 75 to 125 years for the state agencies involved to release those to the public. And in the meantime, they're available only to the person named on the record and their immediate family, usually. Another example would be marriage records, where they may not be available for 50 to 75 years. And usually those who can access these restricted records that are recent are a spouse, children, direct descendants, or legal representatives. So if you are one of those individuals, then you probably can access the records that you want. In thinking about United States research, there are some time periods that are a little bit easier than others, especially for beginners. So if you're considering choosing one of your grandparents or great-grandparents to research, that could be within this golden period from 1880 to 1950, where there are federal censuses every 10 years, and there's a lot of documentation and vital records availability. So this is a good time period to consider. Then be aware also of the 1890 census gap. The 1890 census was destroyed and there was a fire in 1921. So this creates some challenges for 1880 to 1900 research. But vital records are available in most states after 1900, some a little earlier, some a little later. But this is a good time period in the 1900s to find those vital records for your parents or your grandparents. So now I'll show you an example of choosing a research objective. So here's an example. Let's say Sidney Charles McDowell, maybe he's one of my close relatives, and I want to learn more about him. So here's a little family tree and a Find a Grave memorial. So what I mentioned earlier is just gathering known information into some sort of organizational place, whether it's a family tree or a document where you can keep track of the family knowledge that you have, and then see if you can add a little bit of sourcing to verify what you have from your starting point or your known information. And you don't want to do a lot of research in this time point because you're still trying to just choose your research objective. But as you review sources that come up as hints in an ancestry tree and things like that, and see if they match your person, you might have questions that come up that can help you choose a research objective. So just kind of getting started with organizing your known information will help you to choose a research question and objective. So cemetery records are a really helpful place to start. They often have clues that can lead you to research questions. They also usually have birth dates and death dates that can help you identify your relative uniquely in the world. So for Sidney Charles McDowell, his Find a Grave has a picture of his headstone, which includes the fact that he was a sergeant in the U.S. Army during World War II. It also includes his birth year as 1902 and death year as 1979, and it shows that he was buried in Yates Center Cemetery in Woodson County, Kansas. And this is super helpful for getting started because we now have an exact place where he was buried and when he died, and his birth year as well, and a full name, and then the fact that he served in the military. So we can derive several questions from this to help us. As we continue to look at ancestry hints in our ancestry tree for Sidney McDowell, we can see that the 1910 census shows a potential family for him, John McDowell and Effie, and Maud is a daughter of this couple, and then Sid is a son of this couple, or at least a son of the head of household. And the census doesn't say if that woman, Effie, is the mother of Sid. It just says that Sid is the son of John. So we can use this as a hypothesis for the parents of Sid, knowing that it could be a different person with the same name, and we don't know for sure if Effie is the mother of Sid. She could have been a second wife. But looking at the information on the census about how she had 4 children and 4 are living, and there's 4 children living in this household, it's a pretty good guess that she's the mother of all 4 of these children. Especially since both of the individuals there say this is their first marriage. So now we've compiled some evidence just from reading the census that John and Effie McDowell are the parents of Sid, and Sid's age seems to match what we know, which is that he was born in about 1902 and he was 7 years old in 1910 here. So this is a good starting point. And then another hint on ancestry is for an obituary of Isla Gertrude McDowell, who married Sidney McDowell on October 10th, 1950, and he died in 1979. So now we're connecting our research subject, Sidney McDowell, with Isla Gertrude McDowell, whose parents, according to the obituary, were Everett and May Gordon Tuttle. So now we know that Isla Tuttle married Sidney McDowell, and we're building the identity of Sidney McDowell here and establishing a little bit more about him and feeling a little more confident about our starting point information. And censuses and obituaries are just both really helpful sources for verifying parent-child relationships. So as you're getting started, it's good to use those. And here are some questions that might arise as we evaluate these two sources that we could potentially use for research objectives. First, what is the maiden name of Effie? So it did state that in the obituary, but if we only had the census, where Effie's maiden name isn't listed, we could use this question as a great research objective. And then, where did Sydney and Isla get married? It doesn't say in Isla's obituary where they got married. It just says they got married in 1950. So we don't know where the marriage took place. So now that we've done a little bit of analysis of our starting point information, we have some questions that we might want to use as our research objective. What was the military service of Sidney Charles McDowell during World War II? Who was the mother of Sidney Charles McDowell? What was the maiden name of Effie McDowell? Where did Sidney Charles McDowell and Isla Tuttle get married? Isla's obituary said they got married in 1950, and her obituary also said that she lived in Kansas most of her life. Now, looking at these questions, we can evaluate each one. The first one is a good open-ended question that will allow us to gather plenty of evidence about his military service from historical context and from military records. One question we might want to address is if the records would be available to us, depending on our relationship with Sidney, would his World War II records be available? And then the next one, who was the mother of Sidney? This is a good open-ended question with a narrow focus about who his mother is specifically. And we're not putting in any guesses as to who the mother is, so it's open-ended and lets us gather all the evidence related to that. And then what was the maiden name of Effie McDowell? This is a very narrow question, and we've already kind of assumed, and the census gave us good reason to, that she's the mother. So we could use this as our question. It is very narrow, so it doesn't leave a lot of space to gather that much other evidence besides just the exact maiden name of Effie. We might want to use something more broad, like identify Effie McDowell in her pre-marriage life, so we could understand her parents and her family situation before she got married. The next question is also very narrow. It's focused in on just one specific event, the marriage, and the exact place that it occurred. And we may run into challenges with records access because if they got married in 1950, then we're running into this time period where some records are still not public because of privacy constraints, and the agencies of the state who have the marriage records may have 100-year rule, 75-year rule, 50-year rule for releasing marriage records to the public. So we'd need to look into that. But it is a good question, and one that is very narrow like this can help you when you're first getting started as a beginner to learn how to do the Research Like a Pro process and not get overwhelmed with gathering so much evidence that you have a lot to write about. So if you're wanting to learn the process on something simple, you can choose a very narrow objective. And if you're wanting to have a more broad objective that allows you the freedom to collect additional evidence and write a longer report, you might want to choose a more open-ended question. Now, for an example, let's say we chose the last objective about where did they get married. We can go to the Kansas website for public health and see if marriage records are available to the public. And down here at the bottom, it says eligibility. Birth, stillbirth, death, marriage, and divorce records in Kansas are not public records. Certified copies of vital records are released to the person named on the record, immediate family, a legal representative, or anyone who can prove a direct interest, such as a named beneficiary or someone who jointly owns property with the person whose record is requested. The record must be necessary for the determination of personal or property rights. Proof of legal representation, direct interest, or written authorization with proper identification is required if the requester is not named on the record or an immediate family member. So this, for example, is a very strict privacy law as far as accessing these birth, stillbirth, death, marriage, and divorce records in Kansas. So it would be challenging to get the exact information from a vital record certificate. Hopefully we would be able to get the marriage information some other place, but it is good to be aware of these limitations for recent records. And if you go back a little bit further in time, like to a grandparent or a great-grandparent, you won't run into these issues as much as if you choose someone closer to you. However, you can accomplish a lot with looking at newspaper records for those closer to you, and sometimes you can find the answer that you want that way. So since the question about where Sidney got married was a little bit narrow and may have records access issues, why don't we go ahead and choose a different research objective, focusing on who the mother of Sidney Charles McDowell was. And here is how we could write that objective. Who was the mother of Sidney Charles McDowell? Sidney was born in 1902 in Kansas, married Isla Gertrude Tuttle on 10 October 1950, and died in 1979. He was buried in the Yates Center Cemetery in Woodson County, Kansas. So this objective is good because it identifies unknown information that we want to find out, the mother of Sidney, and it also identifies Sidney uniquely. It tells us where and when he was born, and because it doesn't give a specific county, we can then use his death or burial information to have a specific place within Kansas to help us really narrow him down to a specific person in a really particular place. So now with this objective, we're ready to go add additional evidence to our initial clue that his mother was named Effie, and to go find additional evidence about that, gather more clues, and compile everything into a written research report at the end of the Research Like a Pro process. All right, so we wrote a research objective, and now our takeaways are that when we're beginning, it's good to review the known information. We can look at family information, hints on ancestry, and analyze what's known and see what's unknown. And then we can brainstorm questions and be sure to review records access restrictions and time periods, and then evaluate the research questions that we have brainstormed. Are they open-ended? Are they narrow, focused? And are there any potential records access issues? After we've done this, then hopefully we can see which research objectives will work best for the project that we want to do this time. When we're beginning at genealogy research or with the Research Like a Pro process, it can feel a little bit daunting and overwhelming, and that's okay. And your first research objective may not be perfect, and that's totally fine. The next time you do this, it will be easier, and my first research objective was very broad, and I tried to gather information about Civil War service from 3 different brothers, and it was so hard to write the report because I was focusing on too many people at once. So there's a lot of advice out there about making the perfect objective, but ultimately it's the most important to just get started, move forward, and do something so that you can learn. And even though my first objective wasn't very good, I learned a lot, and I was able to make improvements the next time I did the Research Like a Pro process. So you can do this, and don't get hung up on trying to make it perfect, and have fun. All right, thanks everyone for listening. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.